What happens when a man who built an empire realizes he's lost everything that truly mattered? This is The Empty Mansion. Rod Marshall thought he had it all: a thriving career, a breathtaking mansion by the sea, and a life of success. But betrayal shattered his world, leaving him to confront the emptiness he built around himself. As he returns to the house that holds his deepest regrets, Rod begins a journey of transformation. Can he rebuild more than just a mansion, or will the shadows of his past consume him? Stay with me. This is a story of loss, redemption, and the power of starting over. Rod Marshall leaned against the balcony of his newest creation, a mansion perched high above the crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean. The late afternoon sun bathed the sprawling estate in hues of gold and orange, while the salty breeze carried the faint scent of the sea. The house was everything he had envisioned, and more. From the intricately designed gardens to the grand floor-to-ceiling windows, it wasn't just a house. It was the pinnacle of his life's work, a tangible testament to his journey from rags to riches. Standing there, he felt a rare flicker of pride. The mansion was more than an achievement. It was a promise to Paula, his wife of 10 years, that their life together could be as grand and enduring as the house he built. He had spared no expense, working late into countless nights to ensure that every detail was perfect. Marble floors imported from Italy, handcrafted fixtures from artisans in France, and a sweeping ocean view that could make even the most cynical soul pause. This wasn't just a home, it was a legacy. Paula had been ecstatic when he revealed the project to her a year ago. She dreamed aloud about family gatherings in the spacious dining hall, hosting lavish parties on the terrace, and creating memories that would last a lifetime. But lately, something had shifted. Rod couldn't put his finger on it, but her excitement seemed muted now, her smiles less frequent. Perhaps she was just tired from the stress of moving into a new home. Or perhaps, he thought, the distance he had created by burying himself in work had grown larger than he cared to admit. As the evening light began to fade, Rod's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was another email, an urgent matter involving one of his recent development projects. He sighed and stepped inside, the luxurious warmth of the mansion surrounding him. The vaulted ceilings and gleaming surfaces seemed to echo his footsteps as he made his way to the study. Even in this triumph, there was no rest. The empire he had built required constant vigilance, constant sacrifice, yet he always believed it was worth it. The study was one of his favorite rooms in the house. It overlooked the ocean and was filled with dark wood bookshelves, leather chairs, and a massive desk that exuded authority. He settled into the chair, scanned the email, and began typing a response. But as the words appeared on the screen, his thoughts drifted back to Paula. She'd been unusually quiet during dinner the night before, her eyes distant as she picked at her meal. He'd tried to draw her out, but her answers were curt, and she excused herself early, claiming a headache. He glanced at the small clock on the desk. Paula should be home soon from her afternoon errands. He considered calling her, but something stopped him. Maybe it was guilt. Guilt that he had been so consumed by his work that he hadn't noticed the growing chasm between them. Or perhaps it was fear. Fear that if he asked her what was wrong, he might not like the answer. Setting the phone down, he stood and walked back to the balcony. The horizon was darkening now, the fiery hues of sunset giving way to the cool blues of twilight. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below seemed louder, almost intrusive. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, trying to push away the unease creeping into his thoughts. Rod had always believed that success required sacrifices, and he had made plenty. Long hours, sleepless nights, missed anniversaries. But he had never doubted that it was for the greater good, for Paula, for their future, for the dream they had built together. Yet, as he stood there in the growing darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere along the way, the dream had shifted. It had become about proving something to himself, to the world, rather than nurturing the life they'd planned. The distant sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped him out of his thoughts. His heart lifted slightly. Paula was home. He turned to head downstairs, rehearsing what he might say to her. Maybe tonight he could leave work aside, really talk to her, and figure out how to bridge the gap that had formed between them. The mansion's grand entrance hall was dimly lit, the crystal chandelier casting soft reflections across the polished floors. He reached the bottom of the staircase just as the front door opened. Paula stepped inside, carrying a small shopping bag, her face illuminated briefly by the headlights of the car as they faded. She looked up and saw him, offering a faint smile. "Hey," she said simply. "Hey," Rod replied, his voice tinged with hope and hesitation. "How was your day?" "Fine," she said, walking past him toward the kitchen. "Just ran a few errands." He watched her retreating figure, the words he had planned suddenly feeling heavy and inadequate. He wanted to call after her, to ask her to sit with him, to talk, to laugh like they used to. But the moment slipped away, and he was left standing alone in the vast expanse of the mansion, the echoes of her footsteps fading into silence. As the night settled over the house, Rod returned to the balcony. The ocean's relentless rhythm continued, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding above it. For the first time, he felt the weight of the house around him, not as a sanctuary, but as a monument to something fragile. And in that moment, he couldn't help but wonder if the mansion, for all its beauty, had become an empty shell, a reflection of something missing in his life. The following weeks brought little relief to Rod Marshall. The tension that had settled over the mansion, once a beacon of triumph, seemed to thicken with every passing day. Paula's presence felt like a shadow. She was there, yet absent in ways that Rod couldn't quite explain. Conversations were polite but brief, and laughter, once a frequent visitor, had vanished entirely. For the first time, the house he had built with so much care began to feel less like a home and more like an echo chamber of unspoken words. Rod buried himself in work, as he always had when life grew complicated. The empire he had built demanded constant attention, and the endless stream of projects provided him with an excuse to avoid addressing the growing divide between him and Paula. Each morning, he left early, retreating to his downtown office where deadlines and meetings shielded him from the storm brewing at home. Yet, even there, her silence followed him, a persistent weight pressing against his chest. One evening, as he returned from yet another late-night meeting, he found Paula seated in the living room. The space, with its towering ceilings and tastefully curated decor, felt unervingly cold despite its opulence. She was curled up on the cream-colored sofa, her legs tucked beneath her, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace. A glass of wine rested on the coffee table, half empty. "You're home late again," she said without looking at him, her voice flat. Rod hesitated, setting his briefcase down near the door. "Yeah, the project downtown is taking longer than expected," he replied, stepping closer. "How was your day?" "Fine," Paula said, her tone making it clear the conversation was already over. She stood, picking up her glass and walking toward the kitchen. Her movement was graceful but deliberate, as though she were retreating from more than just a room. Rod sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. This had become their routine. Exchanges that went nowhere, each retreating into their own corners of the house. He couldn't pinpoint when things had changed, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. The mansion, once a shared dream, now seemed to amplify their isolation. Determined to bridge the gap, Rod planned a dinner out for the weekend. He reserved a table at one of Paula's favorite restaurants, hoping the change of scenery might spark something between them. When he mentioned the plan, her response was lukewarm. "Sure, if you think we can find the time," she said, her focus fixed on her phone. On the night of the dinner, Rod dressed carefully, selecting a tailored suit that he knew Paula liked. As they sat across from each other at the elegantly set table, the flickering candlelight cast soft shadows on her face. For a moment, Rod thought he saw a glimmer of the woman he had fallen in love with, her delicate features, the slight curve of her smile, but the spark quickly faded. The conversation was strained. Rod spoke about his projects, filling the silence with details of contracts and developments, while Paula nodded absently. When he asked about her day, Her responses were brief, as though she were holding something back. By the time dessert arrived, Rod's optimism had soured into frustration. "Is everything okay, Paula?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "You've been distant lately. I just want to understand." Paula's gaze flicked up from her plate, and for a moment her expression softened. But then she looked away, shaking her head. "I don't know, Rod. Maybe I just need some space." "Space?" he repeated, his chest tightening. "Space from what? From me? From this?" He gestured vaguely, unsure whether he meant the restaurant, their relationship, or the life they had built together. Paula sighed and set her fork down. "I'm not sure. I feel like we're not the same anymore. This house, your work. It's like there's no room for us in all of it." Her words struck a nerve. Rod's immediate instinct was to defend himself, to list all the sacrifices he had made for their life together. But something about her tone stopped him. Instead, he nodded slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I didn't realize you felt that way," he said, his voice quieter now. "I've been trying, Paula. I really have." She looked at him then, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something else. Regret, perhaps. "I know you have, Rod, but sometimes trying isn't enough." The drive home was silent. Paula stared out the window, her reflection blending with the darkened streets as they passed. Rod gripped the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts racing. He replayed their conversation in his mind, searching for a way to fix things, to bring back the lightness that had once defined their relationship. But no matter how he framed it, he couldn't shake the feeling that something vital had already slipped away. When they arrived at the mansion, Paula went straight to their bedroom without a word. Rod lingered in the hallway, staring at the sweeping staircase that led to the upper floors. The house felt impossibly large around him, its grandeur now a reminder of all that he was losing. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. That night, as he lay awake in the vast, empty bed, Rod couldn't help but wonder if the cracks in their foundation had been there all along, hidden beneath layers of ambition and routine. And now, as they began to surface, he was no longer sure if they could be repaired. Rod Marshall's week had been as chaotic as usual. Meetings, phone calls, and endless emails consumed his time, leaving little room for much else. He told himself that his efforts were worth it, that his success and dedication were investments in his future, his marriage, and the life he had built with Paula. But despite the long hours and late nights, the distance between them only seemed to grow. Friday arrived with a rare break in Rod's schedule. A client meeting was unexpectedly canceled, giving him the chance to leave the office early. The idea of surprising Paula and spending an evening together felt like the right move. He imagined the two of them sitting on the balcony, watching the sunset, maybe even sharing a laugh like they used to. The thought brought a faint smile to his face as he pulled into the winding driveway of their coastal mansion. The first sign that something was wrong was the car. Parked in his usual spot in the driveway was a sleek black sedan he didn't recognize. Rod frowned, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. It wasn't unusual for Paula to have visitors, but something about the sight of that car stirred an uneasy feeling in his chest. He told himself it was nothing, that she might have invited a friend over or scheduled a meeting with one of the decorators. Stepping out of his car, Rod straightened his tie and made his way to the front door. He pushed it open, greeted by the familiar scent of the ocean breeze wafting through the house. The hallway was quiet, save for the faint hum of music coming from the living room. His footsteps echoed across the marble floors as he moved toward the sound, each step heavier than the last. When he reached the living room, he froze. There, in the room he had designed to be a sanctuary for their love and happiness, Paula was standing close to a man Rod didn't know. The man was tall, dressed in a crisp shirt with the kind of casual confidence that Rod immediately despised. They were talking softly, their heads close together, but it was the way Paula's hand lingered on the man's arm that made the blood drain from Rod's face. "Paula!" Rod's voice broke the quiet, sharp and disbelieving. She turned abruptly, her face paling as her eyes met his. For a moment, the room felt suspended in time, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The man stepped back, his expression unreadable, but Paula's reaction was unmistakable guilt. "Rod," she started, her voice trembling. "I didn't expect you home so early." "Clearly," Rod said, his tone icy. He glanced between her and the man, who now looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight as though contemplating an escape. "Who is this?" The man opened his mouth to respond, but Paula raised a hand, silencing him. "This is a friend," she said quickly. "He was just leaving." Rod's jaw tightened. "A friend," he repeated, the words bitter on his tongue. "Is that what we're calling this?" "Rod, please, let me explain," Paula began, but he held up a hand, cutting her off. "Don't," he said, his voice low but firm. "Don't insult me by pretending this is something it's not." He turned to the man, his eyes narrowing. "You should go. Now." The man hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding and making his way toward the door. As soon as it closed behind him, an oppressive silence filled the room. Paula stood there, wringing her hands, her eyes shiny with unshed tears. Rod stayed rooted in place, his mind racing but his body frozen. "Rod," she said softly, stepping closer, "it's not what you think." He laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and humorless. "It's exactly what I think, Paula. Don't play me for a fool." "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice breaking. "I've been so lonely and you've been so distant. I didn't know how to reach you." Her words stung more than he wanted to admit. Rod's chest heaved as he struggled to process what was happening. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but instead, all he felt was an overwhelming wave of sadness. "Lonely," he said finally, his voice hollow. "In this house I built for us? In this life I worked so hard to give you? Was it really not enough?" Paula's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't answer. Her silence was all the confirmation he needed. Without another word, Rod turned and walked out of the room. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay there, not in that moment. The walls of the mansion seemed to close in on him as he moved through the hallways, the weight of betrayal pressing down on his shoulders. He found himself outside, the cool evening air hitting his face as he stepped onto the driveway. The black sedan was gone, but its presence lingered, a reminder of everything that had just unraveled. Rod got into his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he sat there, staring at the house that had once been his dream, now tainted by the bitter reality of what it had become. As the first stars began to appear in the night sky, Rod finally started the car. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay. The mansion, his sanctuary, his pride, was no longer a home. It was a hollow monument to a life that had slipped through his fingers. The days following his departure from the mansion blurred together into an endless stream of nothingness for Rod Marshall. He had driven aimlessly that night, the coastal road stretching ahead of him as his mind raced with anger, pain, and disbelief. By the time he stopped, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon, and he found himself parked in front of a small, nondescript motel. It wasn't much, but it offered the one thing he desperately needed: distance. The motel room was a far cry from the luxurious surroundings he was used to. The carpet was threadbare, the furniture mismatched, and the faint scent of mildew lingered in the air. Yet, in its simplicity, Rod found a strange comfort. The silence of the room allowed him to confront the storm raging within him. For days, he barely left the room. Calls from his office went unanswered, emails ignored. His assistant, sensing something was wrong, sent several concerned messages, but Rod didn't have the energy to respond. The empire he had spent years building suddenly felt meaningless. What was the point of all his success if it couldn't protect him from the pain of betrayal? His thoughts often drifted back to Paula. He replayed their last conversation in his mind, dissecting every word, every expression. Her admission of loneliness cut him deeply. Had he truly been so consumed by his work that he hadn't noticed her slipping away? Or was this just an excuse, a way to shift the blame for her choices? The questions gnawed at him, but no answers came. One evening, as he sat by the window watching the rain streak down the glass, Rod's phone buzzed on the nightstand. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, as he had so many times in the past week. But something compelled him to pick it up. The screen lit up with a message from his assistant, Karen. Asterisk, Mr. Marshall. I hope you're okay. Just wanted to let you know that the office is handling things, but we're all here if you need anything. Asterisk. Rod stared at the message for a long time before typing a short reply. Asterisk, thanks, Karen. I'll be in touch. Asterisk, it wasn't much, but it was a start. As he set the phone down, he realized that he couldn't stay in this limbo forever. The world hadn't stopped turning because his life had fallen apart. If anything, it seemed to be moving faster, dragging him along whether he liked it or not. The next morning, Rod checked out of the motel and rented a modest apartment on the other side of town. It was small but clean, with a simple layout that felt refreshingly uncomplicated. He furnished it with the bare essentials: a bed, a table, a couch. It wasn't home, but it was a place to start over. Rod's days settled into a monotonous routine. He woke early, went for long walks along the beach, and spent hours staring at his laptop without ever opening it. He avoided the news and social media, unwilling to see reminders of the life he had left behind. The mansion, once a source of pride, now loomed in his mind as a monument to failure. He couldn't bring himself to drive past it, even when work required him to be nearby. One afternoon, as he walked along the shoreline, Rod's thoughts turned to the house again. He wondered what Paula was doing, whether she had moved on or was struggling with her own regrets. The thought filled him with a complicated mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and an aching sense of loss. He kicked a stone into the surf, watching as the waves swallowed it whole. Rod knew he couldn't avoid reality forever. The mansion, with all its memories and pain, wasn't just a part of his past. It was a piece of his identity. Selling it would be the logical step, a clean break that might allow him to move forward. But the idea of someone else living there, walking through those halls, felt unbearable. He wasn't ready to let it go, even if it meant prolonging his torment. The decision came unexpectedly one evening as Rod sat in his apartment, flipping through old photos on his phone. He stumbled upon an image of the mansion taken shortly after its completion. The picture was perfect. The sun setting behind the house, casting a warm glow over its grand facade. But what struck Rod most was the expression on Paula's face as she stood beside him in the photo. She looked radiant, her smile wide and genuine. It was a stark contrast to the strained, distant woman he had seen in recent months. Rod set the phone down and leaned back, closing his eyes. The memories of what the mansion had meant to him, to them, were too vivid to ignore. He couldn't keep running from it. If he was ever going to find peace, he needed to confront the place that had come to symbolize both his greatest triumph and his deepest pain. The following day, Rod called his lawyer to arrange a visit to the mansion. He wasn't sure what he hoped to achieve, but he knew he couldn't stay away any longer. The house might no longer be a home, but it was still his. And if there was any chance of reclaiming the part of himself he had lost, it would start there. Rod Marshall's car crept up the familiar winding driveway, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The mansion loomed ahead, its grand facade framed by the late afternoon sunlight. It was exactly as he had left it, yet it felt entirely different. The sight of the house brought a wave of conflicting emotions: pride in what he had built, sorrow for what it had become, and trepidation for what lay ahead. The silence of the grounds was palpable as he parked near the front entrance. The once pristine gardens were overgrown. The vibrant colors of the flowers faded into muted greens and browns. Even the fountain in the center of the circular driveway had stopped running, its stone basin now dry and speckled with leaves. Rod stepped out of the car and stood for a moment, taking it all in. The air was thick with memories, each step toward the house pulling him deeper into the past. He unlocked the front door and pushed it open, the creak of the hinges echoing through the cavernous space. The foyer, once the heart of their shared dream, now felt cold and abandoned. Dust coated the marble floors, and the grand chandelier above him seemed dimmer, its brilliance dulled by months of neglect. He inhaled deeply, the scent of stale air and forgotten moments settling in his chest. Rod walked slowly through the house, his footsteps deliberate and heavy. Each room he entered was like opening a time capsule. The dining room still held the long mahogany table where they had hosted dinner parties. The library's shelves were still lined with books, their spines untouched since the day he'd left. Even the living room, the room where he had first confronted Paula, felt frozen in time. The wine glass she had left on the coffee table was still there, a thin layer of dust now coating its surface. As he moved through the house, he couldn't escape the overwhelming sense of loss. It wasn't just the loss of Paula or their marriage. It was the loss of a dream, of a life he had worked tirelessly to build. This house had been his sanctuary, a testament to his achievements. Now, it was a hollow shell, its emptiness a mirror of his own feelings. Rod's footsteps eventually led him to the balcony off the master bedroom. The view was as stunning as ever. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, the waves crashing against the cliffs below. The sight was both beautiful and haunting, a stark reminder of the nights he had stood here, envisioning a future that no longer existed. He gripped the railing, his knuckles whitening as he tried to steady himself against the tide of emotions threatening to pull him under. "Why did it have to end like this?" he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. He had poured everything into this house, into his marriage, into the life he thought they were building together. And yet, it had all crumbled, leaving him to sift through the ruins alone. The sound of a car engine broke the silence, snapping Rod out of his reverie. He turned to see a sleek black sedan pulling into the driveway. His chest tightened. For a brief, irrational moment, he wondered if it was the same car he had seen that fateful day. But as the driver stepped out, Rod recognized him immediately. Alan Stone, his lawyer and longtime confidant. Alan waved as he approached the house, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Rod," he said, extending a hand. "It's good to see you. You've been hard to reach lately." Rod shook his hand and offered a faint smile. "Yeah, I've been sorting some things out." Alan nodded, his gaze drifting to the mansion behind them. "Still an impressive place, even like this. Are you ready to talk about what you want to do with it?" Rod hesitated. That was the question, wasn't it? He'd come here looking for answers, hoping to find some clarity amidst the chaos of his thoughts. But standing in the house, surrounded by memories both cherished and painful, he realized he didn't have a plan. "I don't know," Rod admitted, his voice heavy. "Part of me wants to sell it, just to get it out of my life. But another part of me," he trailed off, struggling to find the words. "Another part of you can't let it go," Alan finished for him. Rod nodded. "Yeah, this place, it's more than just a house. It's everything I worked for. It's everything I lost." Alan studied him for a moment before speaking. "Then maybe it's not about holding on to it or letting it go. Maybe it's about finding a new purpose for it." Rod frowned, the words settling uncomfortably in his mind. "A new purpose?" "Yeah," Alan said. "You've spent your life building things, Rod. Maybe it's time to rebuild. Turn this place into something that means more than just a reminder of what's gone." Rod stared at Alan, the idea slowly taking root. Rebuild. It sounded so simple, yet so daunting. Could he really transform this house, this symbol of his greatest pain, into something new? Something meaningful? "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Rod said finally. "You might surprise yourself," Alan replied with a small smile. "Sometimes the hardest step is just deciding to start." Rod turned back toward the house, his gaze lingering on the balcony, the windows, the walls that had witnessed so much. For the first time in months, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time: possibility. The idea of rebuilding lingered in Rod Marshall's mind for days after his conversation with Alan. It was a daunting prospect, but it also offered a glimmer of hope. Sitting in his modest apartment, he stared at the blueprints of the mansion spread across the table. They were a reminder of what the house had once represented: ambition, love, and a future he had believed in. If the mansion could no longer be what it was, perhaps it could become something entirely new. Rod's first step was reaching out to Mike Reynolds, an old friend and one of the contractors who had helped build the mansion. Mike was a practical man, with a keen eye for detail and a knack for finding creative solutions to complex problems. When Rod explained his vision over the phone, Mike's response was immediate. "You're serious about this?" Mike asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. "I am," Rod said. "I want to turn the house into something meaningful, something that gives back." "Well, it's going to take time, money, and a hell of a lot of work," Mike replied. "But if anyone can pull it off, it's you." With Mike on board, the two began sketching out ideas. Rod envisioned transforming the mansion into a retreat center, a place where people could come to heal, reflect, and find new purpose. He imagined the grand dining room hosting workshops, the expansive gardens offering moments of quiet solitude, and the spacious bedrooms providing comfort for those seeking refuge. The house, once a symbol of his personal loss, could become a sanctuary for others. The process of renovation began slowly. Mike and his team arrived at the property armed with tools and plans, their voices echoing through the empty halls as they assessed what needed to be done. Rod joined them daily, rolling up his sleeves and immersing himself in the work. The physical labor was cathartic, each hammer strike and brushstroke helping him chip away at the bitterness that had settled in his heart. Despite the progress, the project wasn't without its challenges. Early on, a structural issue was discovered in the east wing of the house, a result of years of neglect. Fixing it would require a significant amount of time and resources. As Mike explained the situation, Rod felt a familiar weight of frustration pressing down on him. "We can do it," Mike said, his tone reassuring. "But it's not going to be easy." Rod nodded, his jaw tight. "We'll find a way." That evening, Rod sat alone on the balcony, the blueprint spread out before him once more. The ocean's rhythmic crashing below served as a backdrop to his thoughts. He had always prided himself on finding solutions, on pushing through obstacles no matter how daunting. This was no different. If anything, the challenges only deepened his resolve. The mansion had been a dream once, and he was determined to make it one again, not just for himself, but for those who would one day walk its halls. As the weeks turned into months, the house began to transform. The overgrown gardens were cleared and replanted with vibrant flowers and lush greenery. The cracked fountain in the driveway was repaired, its gentle trickle of water bringing a sense of life back to the property. Inside, the walls were repainted, the floors polished, and the rooms reimagined with purpose and care. Each space told a new story, one of hope and renewal. Word of Rod's project began to spread through the community. Neighbors, once distant and curious, started to take notice. Some offered words of encouragement, while others volunteered their time and skills. A retired carpenter donated his expertise to restore the intricate woodwork in the library. A local artist offered to create a mural in the main hall, capturing the spirit of transformation that defined the project. Rod was humbled by the outpouring of support, each act of kindness reinforcing his belief that the mansion's new purpose was worth every effort. Despite the progress, there were moments when the weight of the past threatened to pull Rod back. One afternoon, while cleaning out the storage room, he stumbled upon a box of photographs. Inside were images of happier times. Him and Paula standing arm in arm, smiling guests at lavish dinner parties, the house filled with life and laughter. The sight of them brought a lump to his throat, but instead of pushing the memories away, he allowed himself to feel the emotions they stirred. This, too, was part of the healing process. By the end of the third month, the mansion was nearly unrecognizable. It no longer felt like a relic of a failed dream, but a living, breathing space with endless potential. Rod stood in the middle of the grand hall one evening, the freshly painted walls glowing softly in the warm light. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. The mansion, his mansion, was no longer a symbol of loss. It was a beacon of hope, ready to welcome those who needed it most. Mike approached him, a satisfied grin on his face. "We're almost there," he said. "Just a few finishing touches and it'll be ready." Rod nodded, a rare smile breaking across his face. "Thanks, Mike, for everything." "Don't thank me yet," Mike said with a chuckle. "There's still plenty to do." As Rod looked around the transformed mansion, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This house had been the site of his greatest heartbreak, but now it held the promise of something far greater. And in that moment he knew he had made the right choice. The mansion was almost ready. Every corner of the house told a new story, its former emptiness replaced by purpose and promise. Rod Marshall had thrown himself into the project, finding solace in the steady rhythm of progress. Yet, as the walls were restored and the gardens flourished, he couldn't shake the feeling that some part of his past still lingered, waiting to be confronted. It was on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon when Rod stumbled upon the box. He had been clearing out the attic, a space he had avoided during the renovations. Dust motes danced in the narrow beams of sunlight filtering through the small window, and the air carried the faint smell of mildew. Most of the boxes were filled with forgotten odds and ends, old linens, and used decorations and abandoned household items. But one box, tucked into the farthest corner, caught his eye. The box was unmarked, its cardboard sides yellowed with age. Rod carried it down to the study. His curiosity piqued. He set it on the desk and carefully lifted the lid. Inside, he found a collection of items that immediately sent a chill through him. Letters, photographs, and keepsakes, all meticulously organized. They were fragments of a life he had left behind, a time when the mansion had been a home. Rod picked up the first letter, his hands trembling slightly. The paper was thick and creased, the ink faded but legible. The letter was addressed to him, and the handwriting was unmistakable. It was Paula's. He hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Slowly, he unfolded the paper and began to read. Rod, I'm writing this because I don't know how to say it to your face. I'm afraid you won't hear me. Or worse, that you'll dismiss what I'm feeling as unimportant. So here it is, plain and simple. I'm lonely. Not the kind of lonely that comes from being alone, but the kind that comes from being invisible. I'm here, Rod. I've always been here. But sometimes I feel like you don't see me anymore. This house is beautiful, and I know how much it means to you, but it's become something else to me. It's a reminder of the space between us, of the conversations we've stopped having, and the moments we've stopped sharing. I don't want to lose you, but I'm afraid we're already lost. I love you, Rod. I need you to love me back. Not with grand gestures or expensive gifts, but with your presence. Please see me again. Please. Paula *. Rod sat back in his chair, the letter trembling in his hands. Her words cut deeper than he had expected. He had always prided himself on providing for Paula, on building a life that was secure and beautiful. But in doing so, he had failed to see what she truly needed. He had been so focused on the dream that he had ignored the cracks forming beneath it. He set the letter aside and reached for another. Each one revealed more of Paula's thoughts and feelings, her struggles and her hopes. The letters weren't angry or accusatory. They were heartbreakingly honest, a testament to her attempts to bridge the distance between them. As he read, Rod felt a mix of regret, guilt, and a strange sense of closure. These letters were a window into the side of their relationship he had never truly understood. Among the letters, Rod found a photograph that stopped him cold. It was a picture of him and Paula, taken in the early days of their marriage. They were sitting on the beach, the sun setting behind them, their smiles wide and genuine. He remembered that day vividly. It had been before the mansion, before the pressures of his career had taken hold. They had been happy then, unburdened by the weight of expectations. Rod set the photograph down and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had spent months rebuilding the mansion, pouring his energy into transforming it into something new. But he realized now that the physical renovations were only part of the process. To truly move forward, he needed to confront the emotional foundation of his past, to acknowledge his mistakes and learn from them. That evening, Rod walked through the mansion with a renewed perspective. He paused in each room, letting the memories surface, but instead of pushing them away, he embraced them. The dining room where they had hosted their first dinner party, the library where they had spent quiet evenings together, lost in books, even the living room, where everything had unraveled, held a bittersweet significance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Rod found himself on the balcony, the letters and photograph in hand. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, its waves steady and relentless. He thought about Paula's words, her plea for connection, and the love they had shared despite everything. He whispered a quiet apology into the wind, unsure if it was for her, for himself, or for both of them. For the first time in a long time, Rod felt a sense of peace. The mansion, once a symbol of his failure, had become a place of healing. And while he couldn't change the past, he could honor it by building a future that mattered. The next morning, Rod placed the letters and photograph back in the box and sealed it. He carried it to the library and tucked it onto a high shelf, not to forget, but to preserve. The house was no longer an empty mansion. It was a testament to resilience, to growth, and to the power of starting over. Rod Marshall had avoided any contact with Paula since the day he left the mansion. The weight of their shared past, their shattered dreams, and her betrayal had been too much to bear. But the letters he found had shifted something within him. They had revealed a side of her he hadn't fully understood. A woman struggling to bridge the gap between them while he remained blind to her needs. He couldn't ignore it anymore. If he truly wanted closure, he needed to face her. The opportunity came unexpectedly. One afternoon, while Rod was overseeing the finishing touches on the mansion's renovations, his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Hesitant, he answered. "Rod," a familiar voice said softly. It was Paula. His grip on the phone tightened. "Paula," he replied, his tone neutral but cautious. "I heard about what you're doing with the house," she continued. "It's unexpected, but I'm glad. It sounds like something meaningful." Rod's jaw clenched. He wanted to ask her why she cared, why she had called, but something stopped him. Instead, he said, "It's been a long time, Paula. Why are you calling me now?" There was a pause on the other end. "Because I need to talk to you. In person. Please, Rod. Can we meet?" After a moment of silence, he agreed. They arranged to meet at a small cafe in town the next day. It wasn't an easy decision, but Rod knew it was necessary. He couldn't keep running from the past. The next afternoon, Rod arrived early. The cafe was quiet, its cozy interior filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the soft murmur of distant conversations. He chose a table near the window and waited, his thoughts racing. What would she say? What could she possibly explain that would make a difference? Paula arrived a few minutes later. She looked different, older, perhaps, but also softer, less guarded. She hesitated at the entrance before spotting him and making her way over. As she sat down, she offered a tentative smile. "Hi, Rod," she said. "Paula," he replied, his voice steady but guarded. "Thanks for coming." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Finally, Paula broke the silence. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "For everything, for what I did to us to you." Rod's expression didn't change. "Why now? Why say this after all this time?" Paula took a deep breath. "Because I've had a lot of time to think, And I've realized that what happened wasn't just about the mistakes you made or the distance between us. It was about me, too. My choices, my fears, my inability to face things head on. I hurt you, Rod, and I'm sorry. Her words were unexpected, disarming. Rod had imagined this conversation 1,000 times, each version filled with anger and accusations. But hearing her take responsibility shifted something in him. I made mistakes too, he admitted, his voice quieter now. I got so caught up in building a life for us that I forgot to actually live it with you. I didn't see how much you were hurting. And for that, I'm sorry too. Paula's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I wish we could have had this conversation before everything fell apart. Maybe things could have been different. Maybe, Rod said, his tone thoughtful. But we can't change the past. All we can do is learn from it. They talked for over an hour, revisiting old memories and confronting the pain they had both carried. Paula told him about her life since their separation, how she had struggled to rebuild and find meaning again. Rod shared his journey of rediscovery, how the mansion had become a symbol of something greater than himself. When they finally stood to leave, the tension between them had eased. The weight of their shared history still lingered, but it no longer felt suffocating. Outside the cafe, Paula turned to him. "Thank you for meeting me," she said. "I hope you find what you're looking for." Rod nodded. "I think I already have. Take care, Paula." As she walked away, Rod felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, closure, and a faint glimmer of hope. The past would always be a part of him, but it didn't have to define him. He had faced it, confronted it, and in doing so, he had freed himself to truly move forward. That evening, back at the mansion, Rod stood on the balcony, watching the sun set over the ocean. The waves crashed against the cliffs below, their rhythm steady and unchanging. He felt lighter somehow, as though the conversation with Paula had lifted a weight he hadn't realized he was still carrying. The house, too, seemed different. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was a testament to resilience, to growth, to the power of starting over. And for the first time in a long time, Rod felt ready to embrace the future. The day of the grand opening arrived faster than Rod Marshall had anticipated. The mansion, once a hollow monument to heartbreak, now stood as a beacon of hope and renewal. Every inch of the property had been transformed, its grandeur restored and its purpose reimagined. For the first time in years, the house wasn't just a place. It was a statement, a testament to resilience and the power of second chances. Rod arrived early that morning, stepping out of his car to admire the finished product. The gardens were vibrant with blooming flowers. The fountain in the driveway sparkled in the sunlight, and the house itself seemed to glow with a new life. He took a deep breath, savoring the moment. Today wasn't just about opening the mansion to the public. It was about opening himself to a future he had never imagined. The first guests began to arrive just before noon. Community members, local artists, and volunteers who had contributed to the renovation gathered in the grand hall. The once dusty chandelier now shone brilliantly, casting soft light across the crowd. Conversations filled the space, accompanied by the faint sound of classical music playing in the background. Rod moved through the room, greeting people, shaking hands, and sharing stories about the mansion's transformation. At the center of the hall stood a large table adorned with refreshments and a guest book. People eagerly wrote their names and left notes of encouragement and gratitude. Many of them had heard about Rod's journey, how he had turned his personal pain into a collective purpose. They marveled at the house's beauty, but it was the story behind it that truly resonated. As the event unfolded, Rod found himself drawn to the library. The room, once heavy with memories, had become his favorite space in the house. The shelves were now filled with books donated by the community, and a reading nook by the window offered a peaceful retreat. Standing there, he spotted a young boy sitting cross-legged on the floor, engrossed in a picture book. The sight brought a smile to Rod's face. This was exactly what he had hoped for, a place where people could find solace, inspiration, and a sense of belonging. A familiar voice broke his reverie. "Looks like it's a hit," Mike Reynolds said, stepping into the room. The contractor and longtime friend had been instrumental in bringing Rod's vision to life. Rod turned to him, nodding. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mike, or the community. Seeing everyone here today, it makes all the work worth it." Mike grinned. "Well, I'm glad you finally figured out that this house isn't just about bricks and mortar. It's about people." Before Rod could respond, Karen, his assistant, appeared in the doorway. "Rod, it's time for your speech," she said with a warm smile. Rod's stomach tightened slightly, but he nodded and followed her back to the grand hall. The crowd quieted as he stepped onto a small stage near the staircase. He took a moment to scan the room, his eyes landing on familiar faces. Mike, Karen, and even a few of the volunteers who had become like family during the renovations. He spotted Paula near the back of the room, standing quietly but offering a supportive nod. Clearing his throat, Rod began. "Thank you all for being here today. This house has been many things over the years. It started as a dream, became a symbol of heartbreak, and now it stands as a testament to resilience and new beginnings." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "When I first started this project, I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Closure, maybe. Redemption. But along the way, I realized that this house isn't just my story. It's our story. It's about the power of community, the strength we find in each other, and the beauty of turning pain into purpose." The audience listened intently, their expressions a mix of admiration and emotion. Rod's voice steadied as he continued. "This mansion is more than walls and windows. It's a place where people can come to reflect, to heal, and to grow. And today, as we open its doors, I hope it becomes a space where stories like mine, stories of struggle and transformation, can inspire others." As he finished, the room erupted into applause. Rod stepped back, his chest swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. He had come a long way from the man who had fled this house in despair. Now, he stood before a room full of people, not as a symbol of failure, but as a testament to the possibility of change. The rest of the day was a blur of conversations, laughter, and moments of quiet reflection. By the time the last guest had left, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the mansion. Rod stood on the balcony, watching the waves crash against the cliffs below. The house, once so empty and lifeless, now felt alive with possibility. Mike joined him, holding 2 glasses of champagne. He handed one to Rod, raising his own in a toast. "To new beginnings," Mike said. Rod smiled, clinking his glass against Mike's. "To new beginnings." As they drank, Rod felt a deep sense of contentment. The mansion, his mansion, had found its purpose, and in doing so, it had given him a new one as well. His sun had barely risen when Rod Marshall found himself standing in the center of the mansion's grand hall. The air was still, filled only with the faint hum of life waking outside. Light streamed through the massive windows, illuminating the polished floors and casting long, soft shadows across the space. The previous night's celebration had been a resounding success, leaving the house alive with energy even in its silence. Yet Rod felt a quiet weight settling over him, not of regret, but of reflection. He walked slowly through the hall, running his hand along the edge of the long table where guests had mingled just hours earlier. The scent of flowers lingered faintly in the air, remnants of the bouquets that had adorned the space. The house, once a hollow monument to heartbreak, had finally become what he always intended it to be, a living, breathing entity filled with purpose and joy. But as Rod moved from room to room, he realized that his own journey wasn't quite finished. In the library, he paused. The bookshelves, once barren, were now filled with donations from the community, each spine a symbol of collective hope and generosity. On a small side table sat the guest book, its pages brimming with messages of gratitude and inspiration. Rod picked it up, flipping through the handwritten notes. A few stood out. "This place saved me. Thank you for believing in second chances." I came here broken and found the strength to start over. This isn't just a house. It's a reminder that even the emptiest spaces can be filled with meaning. Rod set the book down carefully, his chest tight with emotion. These words weren't just reflections of the mansion's impact. They were affirmations of his own transformation. For so long, he had poured himself into creating something external, something tangible. But now, he understood that the mansion's rebirth mirrored his own. Later that morning, as Rod prepared for the day, Karen arrived with an unexpected visitor. Paula. She stood at the threshold, her expression hesitant yet resolute. The years had softened her in ways that Rod hadn't anticipated. Her gaze wandered across the restored facade of the house before settling on him. "Paula," he said, his voice a mixture of surprise and calm. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I heard about the opening," she replied, stepping forward cautiously, "and I needed to see it for myself." "To see you." Rod gestured for her to follow him into the living room, where the fireplace crackled softly. They sat across from each other, the space between them filled with unspoken words. Paula's eyes scanned the room, taking in the details. "It's beautiful," she said finally. "You've done something incredible here, Rod." "Thank you," he replied. "But it's not just me. The community, the volunteers, it's been a collective effort." She nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've thought a lot about what happened between us, about what we both lost." Rod leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "And—" Paula hesitated before meeting his gaze. "I think we were both searching for something we didn't know how to find. I blamed you for a lot, but I realized that I didn't know how to ask for what I needed." Her honesty struck a chord deep within him. "I was so focused on building a life for us that I didn't see what we were losing in the process. For that, I'm sorry." Paula's eyes filled with unshed tears, but she smiled faintly. "I'm sorry, too, for everything." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was a moment of shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of their mutual growth. They weren't the same people who had once shared this house, but perhaps that was the point. The mansion had transformed, and so had they. As Paula stood to leave, she turned back to him. "You've turned this house into something extraordinary. I hope you know that." Rod nodded. "Thank you, Paula. That means more than you know." As the weeks passed, the mansion continued to thrive. It became a sanctuary for people from all walks of life. Artists seeking inspiration, families looking to reconnect, individuals searching for peace. The once empty halls were now filled with laughter, music, and the hum of shared stories. One evening, Rod found himself walking through the gardens as the sun set. The fountain sparkled in the fading light, its gentle rhythm a soothing presence. He stopped near a newly planted tree, a magnolia, donated by a guest whose life had been deeply impacted by the mansion. Mike joined him, carrying 2 glasses of whiskey. "Figured you'd need one of these," he said, handing Rod a glass. Rod chuckled softly. "You know me too well." They stood in companionable silence, watching the sky transition from gold to deep indigo. "What's next for you, Rod?" Mike asked eventually. Rod took a sip of his whiskey, the warmth spreading through him. "I think I've finally learned to stop planning every step. This place has a life of its own now, and I'm happy to see where it takes me." Mike nodded approvingly. "You've done good, Rod. Better than good. This house, it's a legacy." Rod's gaze lingered on the mansion, its windows glowing warmly against the night. "It's more than a legacy," he said softly. "It's a second chance. For me, for everyone who walks through those doors." That night, as Rod stood on the balcony one last time, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The stars above were brilliant, their light mirrored by the mansion's glow. The house was no longer empty. It was full of life, purpose, and possibilities yet to be discovered. Rod closed his eyes, breathing deeply as the ocean's rhythm filled his senses. This was no longer just a house. It was a beacon for hope, for healing, and for the countless lives it would touch in the years to come. And in that moment, Rod knew he was finally home. The following morning brought a fresh wave of visitors, each arriving with their own stories and hopes. Rod greeted them personally, shaking hands and listening intently. Among the guests was a young artist who carried a portfolio of sketches. She showed Rod her drawings, each inspired by the mansion's rebirth. One sketch, in particular, caught his eye, a depiction of the mansion's facade with rays of light emanating from its windows, as if the house itself radiated hope. "This is incredible," Rod said, holding the sketch carefully. "Would you consider hanging this in the library?" The artist's face lit up. "I'd be honored." Moments like these reaffirmed Rod's belief in the power of the mansion. It wasn't just a place to visit. It was a place to leave a mark, to find a part of oneself that had been lost. As the day unfolded, Rod moved through the house with a quiet confidence, feeling more connected to its purpose with every interaction. In the evening, as the last of the guests departed, Rod returned to the balcony. He stood there for a long time, watching the waves crash against the cliffs below. The mansion behind him was alive, its windows glowing warmly in the night. For years, this house had been a symbol of emptiness, of dreams unfulfilled. Now, it was so much more. It was a place where lives intersected, where healing began, and where hope was reborn. Rod took a deep breath, the salty air filling his lungs. The journey that had brought him here had been painful, but it had also been necessary. The mansion's transformation mirrored his own, and in its rebirth, he had found his purpose. As the stars filled the sky, Rod whispered softly, "This is just the beginning." And for the first time in years, he truly believed it. Enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.